Greetings to you from beautiful Fiji in the South Pacific, where we'd like to tell you a bit about the Natewa Swallowtail, specifically about mobilizing communities to protect a newly described Fijian species from local and external threats. And we, in this case, is a team. Myself, Richard Markham, a retired entomologist, now a cocoa farmer here in Fiji. Nunia Thomas-Moko, who is the director of NatureFiji-MareqetiViti, that's Fiji's leading conservation organization, and Clive Huggins, also an entomologist at the Natural History Museum in London, joining us from the UK. So, the Natewa Swallowtail takes its name from the beautiful Nateawa Peninsula in Fiji. That's the land on the left side of your picture there, and looking out over the pristine waters of the Nateawa Bay on the right. So the Natewa Swallowtail came to the attention of Western science in the context of the Fiji program of Operation Wallacea, which is a British-based educational charity that brings young people to areas of conservation importance all around the world, gives them a taste of field research while contributing to the knowledge of the areas. In their studies, they're guided by experienced scientists from Europe, North America, New Zealand, and Australia. It was one of these last, Greg Kerr, an Australian naturalist, who first photographed the swallowtail in 2017. To obtain an identification, he sought help from the Swallowtail and Birdwing Butterfly Trust, the SBBT, in the UK. Butterfly's appearance was so unlike any other swallowtail from the Pacific Islands that some people initially believed the photo to be a fake. The SBBT then sent entomologists to join the Operation Wallacea field seasons in 2018 and 2019 to follow up on the initial discovery of the swallowtail and survey the butterfly fauna of the area more generally. These are some of the students who first observed the swallowtail in these degraded forest habitats in 2018. The initial observations by John Tennant and Visheshni Chandra led to the scientific description of the Natewa swallowtail in late 2018 by Tennant, Chandra, and Muller. That's their publication on the left. And in the 2019 field season, further observations were made by co-author Clive Huggins and Visheshni Chandra. Here they are in action in the Natewa Peninsula. The publication of the description exposed an immediate threat. Within just a few weeks, collectors arrived from several countries, and shortly thereafter, several specimens were available for sale on the internet. One of the collectors even seems to have managed to smuggle out live material, leading to a partial publication of the life cycle in Japanese, as it happens. So Fiji, unfortunately, is not accustomed to the attention of wildlife collectors and smugglers on this scale. It has some appropriate legislation in place, but does not yet have the biosecurity staff trained and equipped to counter the threat of serious collectors. The COVID-related travel ban has given us a breathing space to put in place a conservation strategy to counter both local and external threats. Before turning to that, just a word or two about the biology and ecology of the butterfly. The distribution of the Natewa swallowtail has not been formally defined. However, the preliminary observations by the SBBT and Operation Wallacea entomologists suggest that the butterfly may be confined to a single forested watershed running some 20 kilometers along the western coast of the Natewa Peninsula. That's part of it in the hills behind this village in the picture there. As elsewhere in Fiji, most of the land in this area is under traditional ownership. The sites where Papilio natewa has so far been regularly observed fall mainly within the traditional land of this village of Vusaratu, but its distribution, from what I've seen, also overflows into the adjacent land of about 3 or 4 adjacent communities. The Natewa Peninsula is almost an island. It's linked to the rest of Vanuatu by only a very narrow isthmus. And like the neighboring island of Taveuni on the right here, the peninsula is recognized for its unique biodiversity, including a number of endemic plants. So it's possible that the limited distribution of the Natewa swallowtail may be linked to the distribution of its larval host plant. The larval host plant was collected by our co-author Clive Huggins with the help of the local Fijian guide Maekavutu in 2019, and was submitted to the National Herbarium by Visheshni Chandra for identification. According to the herbarium, it's an ebony, that's a Diospora species in the family Ebenaceae. This is really unusual in terms of papilionids. Studies of the coevolution of papilionids and flowering plants in Queensland for instance, published by Schreiber et al. From 2008 onwards, suggests that most swallowtails use as their larval host plants species of ancient angiosperms, the Magnoliales. That's families such as Magnoliaceae, Ananaceae, Aristolochiaceae, and Lauraceae, as well as, of course, Rutaceae, a family of more recent evolutionary origin, but still somewhat related to these ancient families and sharing some phytochemical characteristics. The Ebonaceae, on the other hand, seem to be totally unrelated. Unfortunately, more than a year after submission of the samples, we still don't have a formal identification. Yasheshni Chandra, who conducted her PhD studies on the Fiji swallowtail, that's Papilio schmeltzi, another endemic, has studied some aspects of the biology of Papilio nateawa in the laboratory, and she's explored its phylogenetic relationships via DNA studies, but these results haven't yet been published. So turning to the conservation strategy, conservation in Fiji, as elsewhere, depends on successful community engagement. Access to the butterfly's habitat is limited via rough tracks and footpaths, and it would be almost impossible for collectors to gain access without guides and permission from the communities who own the land. A grant provided by SBBT to NatureFiji-MareqetiViti will provide the core of the effort to engage and mobilize the local communities for the conservation efforts, but Nunia will tell us a bit more about that in a moment. The forest where the butterfly is found has been identified as an important bird area. That's by BirdLife International, of course, the brown area in this map. There have been discussions with the communities about the value of the forest and the importance of protecting it. But it's important to emphasize that currently the area has no formal statutory protection. The most urgent local threat comes from deforestation driven by the high price of kava. Kava, that's Piper methisticum, is a mildly narcotic plant of great cultural importance in Melanesia. It was traditionally grown around the village in a polyculture system typical of Polynesia. However, as kava becomes a commercial cash crop, farmers turn to the slash and burn bush fallow agricultural system more typical of Melanesia, resulting in a rapid increase in the rate of deforestation, as you can see on the left here. Community members are at least aware of the negative impacts of deforestation, including particularly soil erosion and siltation of the coral reefs, which they're important to them for their food supply. They're also aware of the reduced, more seasonal supply of fresh water for drinking. And they've mentioned to us that they're obliged to walk ever further to their farms in search of fertile soil. However, they don't seem to see this situation as a crisis, or perhaps they don't really recognize it as something over which they have control through their land use decisions and better natural resource management. So our higher level strategy is to try to reverse the economic drivers of deforestation, and particularly to match the income that the community currently receives from unsustainable kava production with more sustainable alternatives that value the forest and its biodiversity and provide an incentive to protect the environment. And then we need to empower and encourage the communities to make the necessary decisions for more sustainable land use based on these alternatives. We see three major opportunities for positive economic drivers: production of high value crops, including kava, but also cocoa, coffee, vanilla, fruits, and so on in a permanent agroforestry setting. Then ecotourism, featuring the biodiversity all the way from rainforest to reef. And thirdly, carbon credits. Matching the lure of kava will be quite a challenge because the number of brand new pickup trucks in the villages testifies to the power of kava derived cash. And many of the houses have a kava drying rack like this one next to them. However, some things may be running in our favor. The price of kava seems to be falling at the moment, and people are certainly aware of the boom and bust cycles in prices for this commodity. Moreover, the environmentally sustainable alternatives should also offer more equitable distribution of livelihood benefits in the community. Slash and burn kava production provides cash mainly to the men in the community, whereas agroforestry and its added value products bring benefits to both women and men. Similarly, with ecotourism, we're trying to help the community set up a transparent system that ensures that the benefits are shared equitably through the community. So far, the guides trained by Operation Wallacea have been entirely men, but this doesn't need to be the case, and we'll be working to change this. And the other services associated with ecotourism, homestays, catering, and so forth, already involve other community members more broadly. We also see a special opportunity for women to develop a cottage industry and handicrafts based on local plant products. In this case, there's a lady making fans and mats from pandanus. These products also represent opportunities for the community to share traditional knowledge about the value of the forest and its biodiversity. Through my own company, KokoMana, and with dive operators Ocean Ventures, which is based on the Natewa Bay and has worked with these communities through Operation Wallacea, we're working with the community to develop their social media presence, their business skills, and ecotourism products ready for the return of visitors. The UNDP-funded Ridge to Reef reforestation project led by Fiji's Ministry of Forestry, and specifically its component 4 led by the Pacific Community, SPC, has funded the construction of a visitor center with a butterfly house and forestry nursery. This is all in Vusaratu, the village where most of the observations of Papilio Natewa have been made. This facility will provide a focus for ecotourism development, highlighting the Natewa swallowtail, but setting it in the broader context of local freshwater, terrestrial, and marine biodiversity. We're taking a truly ridge to reef approach and emphasizing the need to conserve the interdependent ecosystems of the Natewa Peninsula and the Natewa Bay in their entirety. The embedded objective, of course, is to encourage the local community to appreciate the value that's financial, functional, and aesthetic of an intact or restored natural environment. For the carbon-related funding, we still need to do a bit more work to define and develop the opportunities. Our current thinking is that despite some initial work by Operation Wallacea, pictured here, and by Fiji's Department of Forestry before that, there is insufficient data for this area to seek formal carbon funding for the moment. We leave open that possibility, but for the moment at least, we believe that businesses with an interest in developing Fiji's sustainable tourism sector, such as local airlines and international hotel chains, may be prepared to purchase carbon offsets as part of their corporate social responsibility programs. And this could be based just on estimates of carbon values rather than really hard data. Turning specifically to the butterfly, the area described by John Tennant as the true natural habitat of Papilio Natewa has subsequently been clear-felled for carver production. Happily, the butterfly can still be seen quite readily, aggregating around trees of the larval host plant in a nearby valley. Casual observations suggest that the butterfly actually aggregates more readily, or perhaps it's just more easily seen, around trees on the forest margin, in this case on the edge of a carver clearing, than around trees in closed canopy forest. This is, of course, encouraging from a conservation point of view, because it suggests that a mosaic of small clearings open for carver production may not be too detrimental to survival of the swallowtail populations, and this perhaps points the way to our conservation strategy. Importantly, the Ministry of Forestry and SPC have agreed to include the swallowtail's larval host plant amongst the species used for reforestation. Unfortunately, our initial experience suggests this species is not readily cultivated under nursery conditions. Moreover, as a forest understory species, it's unlikely to compete well with pioneer species in a reforestation setting. However, our initial strategy will therefore be to try to reforest the carver plots with more competitive species such as Coca, Bischoffia javanica, which is a Euphorbiaceae, and this has the added advantage that it's locally reputed to restore soil fertility. Then we can transplant Diospora seedlings into the surviving forest adjacent to the carver clearings. In this way, we hope to increase the reproductive success of the surviving Natewa swallowtail populations, as well as, by the way, making it some parts of the population visible for ecotourism. In parallel, we'll attempt captive breeding of the Natewa swallowtail in the butterfly house. At the moment, that's just furnished with a few trees of Micromelon minutum. That's the larval host plant of Papilio schmeltzi, the Fiji swallowtail. But we're getting the Diosporus going as well. The facility will have the dual objective of raising public awareness of the Natewa swallowtail and the threats to its existence. as well as we hope producing a surplus of butterflies to support the repopulation of newly reforested areas. The butterfly house will also feature a number of easily reared local butterfly species selected to pique the interest of visitors and to highlight the striking biodiversity of the Nateawa Peninsula. Here are just a few, very few examples. Obviously, there's no single solution. Rather, we're trying to build a basket of options that make sense both in terms of Western-style economic incentives to conserve the forest and in terms of traditional views of community responsibility for the stewardship of natural resources. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Nunia to explain a bit more about the role of NatureFiji-MareqetiViti in the conservation strategy. Nunia, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. The Nateawa Peninsula is part of Fiji's second largest island, Vanua Levu. Vanua translating to English as land. However, from the conservation perspective, it is important to understand that for a Fijian, particularly for the Itoke, Vanua also captures the close relationship between people, their land, and its natural resources. The community takes responsibility for terrestrial resources at the clan level and has customary use of coastal marine resources at the tribal level or the Yavusa. In some parts of Fiji, the tribal and clan leaders have appointed village-based committees to oversee the management of communal resources. In this regard, the concept of fishing reserves designated as tambu or protected is well established in traditional practice. Forest reserves are perhaps not part of the traditional system in the sense that all clan land is regarded as available for cultivation, but communities are at least implicitly aware of the need for long-term, for long bush fallow periods to restore soil fertility. And this may, depending on the local ecology, allow forest regrowth. Some forested watersheds were designated during colonial times as government land, and indeed some of the land within the general area of interest for the conservation of the Natewa Swallowtail has been managed by the Forestry Department for many decades, with some blocks designated as commercial forestry leases. Most of what now looks like natural forest has been logged in the past, and the network of logging roads established during this earlier exploitation continues to pose a threat to the integrity of the forest. Just as Operation Wallacea uses the old logging roads as research transects, as you can see on the picture here, farmers also use them for access when they penetrate into the forest to clear new land for cover production or for other farming. The SBBT grant allows NatureFiji-MareqetiViti to recruit an intern who will contribute to a better understanding of the ecology of the Natewa Swallowtail, especially by working with the community to delimit the current range and incidence of the butterfly and its food plant. Demonstrating the swallowtail's limited range will highlight its vulnerability and help to build a case for statutory protection. Above all, this engagement with the community will help further discussion about the value of biodiversity conservation and the importance of more sustainable land use and natural resource management. This is a discussion that we have already begun through the initial community consultations, as you can see on the picture here. The SBBT grant also allows us to recruit a field assistant from the local community. This person will be trained by our specialists to take care of the plants, butterflies, and facilities. Their work will include collecting seed and seedlings of the larval food plant of the Natewa Swallowtail and establishing it in the nursery, butterfly house, and surrounding plantings, along with suitable nectaring plants for the adult butterflies. With the help of our entomologists, we plan to establish the rearing of the Natewa Swallowtail in the butterfly house to support releases of the surplus butterflies produced. In this effort, we shall learn from the efforts of SBBT to support the conservation of other swallowtail and birdwing butterfly species. Over the next few months and years, NatureFiji-MareqetiViti will engage with the appropriate stakeholders, particularly the Fiji Ministry of Environment, to develop necessary legislative and administrative measures for the protection of the Natewa Swallowtail. And just as we have done for other vulnerable species among Fiji's rich endemic biodiversity. Effective conservation involves building up from the community level, building down from the national and local government, and engaging with the general public to raise awareness and mobilize necessary actions. Again, We shall base this on the many years of experience of campaigns on behalf of other unique Fijian species.
So Clive, to the conclusion, over to the UK.
Thank you, Richard. So in conclusion, already community members in Vusaratu are taking a keen interest in and ownership of the butterfly house and tree nursery. It's particularly encouraging to see the children involved in this. Ministry of Forestry is already leading the broad reforestation effort, and their readiness to include the butterfly larval host plant, along with other useful species produced in the tree nursery, underlines their support for the biodiversity conservation effort. Indeed, the Minister of Forestry is expected to officially open the Visitor Centre as soon as the butterfly house is planted up and the COVID-related restrictions on travel and assembly may allow. There are a number of steps to be taken to achieve the statutory protection of both the butterfly's forest habitat and of the Nateawa Swallowtail as a species. However, over the last year, several key steps have been taken towards achieving this goal. Much then depends on the return of tourists to Fiji to revive the economy, and especially the arrival of responsible eco-tourists to provide incentives for the conservation effort locally. Our vision for a successful future includes the following outcomes. 1. Vusaratu and neighbouring communities will have a greater appreciation of the biodiversity that flourishes on their traditional land, the threats to its existence and the value that can be derived from its conservation. 2. Based on this awareness, communities will take biodiversity into account in their land management decisions, allocating some areas for conservation and employing more sustainable methods in their farming. 3. Communities will derive more income from sources linked to biodiversity conservation and environmental quality, such as ecotourism, cultural tourism, and agri-tourism. 4. The Nateawa region will be recognized as an ecotourism destination within Fiji and beyond. And finally, the survival of the Natewa Swallowtail will be assured as the flagship of this effort. Thank you very much.